Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor at large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. And today's conversation will discuss two big topics. First, Donald Trump's growing calls for Canada to become the 51st state. And second, Justin Trudeau's resignation as Prime Minister and its implications for Canadian politics. David, we have a lot to talk about. Thanks for joining me.
Hello from downtown Toronto.
David, as you know, since soon after Donald Trump's election in November, Canadian politics have been seized by his threat of across-the-board tariffs. Now he's threatening to use so-called economic warfare to convince us to become absorbed in the United States. The talk of Canada becoming the 51st state seemed like a trolling move at first, but it's kept up and even escalated. What are we supposed to make of it? How should we understand these provocations targeting Canada?
All right. Well, Donald Trump, as the whole world has learned by now, is not a settled thinker. But it's also true that his words don't mean nothing.
Yes.
And what you're seeing here are a series of sparks coming off a source. And while they may or may not ignite into flame, they definitely indicate a threat and certainly reveal settled animosity. That Trump has made a series of aggressive threats against other allies. He's threatened to annex Greenland, which is a self-governing autonomous unit within Denmark. He has threatened to seize the Panama Canal Zone from Panama. He's made many dark threats against Ukraine, warning of a cutoff. He's also put a lot of pressure on Israel to end its operations in Gaza on terms that are short of the decisive defeat of Hamas that Israel had committed itself to. So there's a lot of pressure being put on a lot of allies, and the pressure on Canada is maybe the most extreme because he's talking about the outright annexation of Canada. Now, again, I don't think he's got a plan. I don't think he's got an exact purpose, but he does have an indication that it's hostile, it's threats. There are tariffs. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith recently returned from a visit to Mar-a-Lago and said, as far as she was concerned, Trump did not intend to exempt Canadian energy from his threat of wide tariffs. So Canada's in for a very hostile environment in the coming months and had better get ready.
Canadian politicians have taken different approaches in response to the president-elect's musings. Some have treated it as a joke. Others have been more defiant.
Yeah.
What would you do if you were in their shoes?
It's certainly not a joke. Thugs and bullies and abusers make jokes, but the jokes are not funny. The jokes are another form of aggression. That by making their targets or their victims laugh along with them, they make their targets or their victims part of, accept the aggression. This is not a way that the head of any government should talk, certainly not a friendly government, and certainly not a friendly government that's the linchpin of the whole system of Western security and territorial integrity. It's outrageous. And I think Trump has taught everyone not to expect even the most minimal kinds of decencies from him, but we shouldn't accept that teaching. These words are not jokes. They are threats. They're not threats joined to a plan, but they're still threats. Now, as we've discussed before, Canadian politicians have a playbook with some variations. The basic idea is to look for concessions to mollify Trump and look for allies against him. That's the classic playbook. And the allies are especially in the U.S. Senate and even more in the state governorships. I was on YouTube the other day and I saw a barrage of ads from the province of Ontario explaining to me how much trade Maryland and Virginia do with the province of Ontario. So that was very precisely targeted to a certain demographic. I was in Washington, D.C. when I saw it. There must be a lot of that going on. So that's plan A. It's a good plan. It has usually worked in the past. It basically worked more or less in the first Trump term. So by all means, try it again as plan A. But it may not be enough. It probably, in my opinion, will not be enough. There will be a need for a plan B, which is some sterner measures that are designed with pain to Canada to induce changes of mind in the United States.
If I can put on a table my biggest fear, which you might characterize as a plan C, and that is, David, the growing salience of economic nationalism in Canada. Just this morning, Wednesday, January 15th, well-known business leader Jim Balsillie has an op-ed in the National Post in which he describes this as, quote, all economic nationalists now. I would put to you the proposition that a lot of Canadian success over the past 40 years or so, in a way, has been about shedding an instinct towards economic nationalism. In light of these provocations from the Trump administration, how do Canadian politicians resist the urge to, in effect, renationalize parts of our economy and start to paint larger borders around our domestic industries?
Well, this is the terrible history of tariffs in the past. Is tariffs are always connected to what does economic nationalism mean? Let's be more explicit. It means state direction of investment.
Yes.
Which is always political. It goes to favored clients. It doesn't go to the best claims, because how can the state possibly know what is the best claim? It goes to favored clients. So state direction of investment. It goes state control of finances, state control of lending. Sooner or later, you're going to need some kind of exchange control to keep the money in the country and prevent it from leaving. When Canada went down this road most seriously in the middle 1970s, it stopped short. There were no exchange controls. But in the middle 70s, and again with the national energy policy of the early 1980s, there was state direction of capital investment. It was a spectacular catastrophe. There were limits on inflows of investment in the 1970s, control of foreign investment in Canada. And again, the system was gamed and favored clients got favored treatment. And my generation of Canadians, and those above us, I was obviously young in those days, learned a lot. Don't do this. This is not just a mistake. It's a mistake that keeps ramifying, because you can't just take one hit off this drug. The drug, you require ever greater hits to get the same effect. And each hit becomes more expensive than the last, until pretty soon you're Argentina in the 1970s and 80s, where you're trying to run this autarkic economy with inflation, with controls, and worse things even than that. Now, most democracies have stopped short from the point where these kinds of economic controls require controls of communication and information, and political controls. But this is the path, and don't walk it. Don't walk it. The United States is big enough and rich enough and sloppy enough that it can make a lot of mistakes before there's a really painful price. But Canada is already under all kinds of economic duress. And the idea of saying, start from where Canada is today and add more bad policy, more status policy, that's really dangerous.
We'll transition to Canadian political leadership in a moment, and its capacity to distinguish between Plan B, which, as you say, might be needed, and Plan C, which would be distortionary and destructive, in a moment. But before we get there, I mentioned that we're speaking on Wednesday, January 15th. Of course, Monday will be President-elect Trump's inauguration. What should we expect in the immediacy of the inauguration and the next couple of days as it relates to Canada, and more broadly in terms of some of the policy actions we'll see from the administration?
Well, an example of the kind, this is not a Canadian-specific example, but an example of the extreme short-sightedness you should expect, and of the no one should feel safe, is Donald Trump campaigned as a huge supporter of the state of Israel. And many in the pro-Israel community believed him and thought he would be better than Joe Biden. Joe Biden both aided Israel, but put limits on Israel's operations, and had a very confused policy where he would scold Israel sometimes and send aid into Gaza in ways that were predictably intercepted by Hamas. So it was kind of a messy and confused policy. And many in the pro-Israel world wanted to believe that Trump was better. Yes. But what Trump has pushed, Trump wants resolutions. He wants wins for Trump.
Yes.
And he's now pushed Israel to a hostage deal. And clearly, the number one priority of this hostage deal is to get the hostages released on either the day before or on Trump's inauguration day, so Trump can get the credit and deny it to anybody else.
Sure.
That's his goal. Hostage release for me, like the hostage release for Ronald Reagan during the Iran hostage crisis of 1981. That makes me Reagan, and Reagan only got 52 hostages. I'm going to get maybe 98, so I'm bigger than Reagan. And whatever long-term risks Israel must take for my festival, it's worth it, because one is a benefit that accrues to me, and that counts, and one is a penalty that accrues to somebody else, and that's worth nothing. Now, Israel is the one foreign country for which Trump professes some affection, some care, and look what he's doing to them. Now, what is he going to do for Ukraine? What is he going to do for Mexico? What is he going to do for Canada? It's going to be a very bumpy environment, and it's. I will agree with the Danielle Smiths and even the Kevin O'Learys that it is possible to manipulate this guy to get better terms from him. That's true, but you have to know that that's what you're doing. You have to understand he's basically malign. He is no friend of yours. He has strong willpower. He's a very ruthless operator. He's manipulating you at the same time.
Yes.
And you have to have a very clear-eyed understanding of what you're trying to achieve. In fairness to Justin Trudeau, in the first couple of years of the Trump administration, I think the Trudeau people did do this. They did manipulate. They flattered him. They cajoled him. They humbled themselves. They played mind games with him, and it worked because they did have an end state, which is to prevent him from busting up NAFTA. And they were not looking for any other rewards. They were not looking for a job as Trump's best friend in the world. But I fear that some of these other manipulators or would-be manipulators today don't have as clear a strategic aim and do think, I'll be Trump's friend. I will get something out of this, rather than simply prevent him from doing bad things.
Yes, yeah. The record of those who thought they could manipulate him and turned out looking poor is pretty long. David, you talked about the bumpy environment that we are bound to experience over the coming weeks and months. That's a good segue to Canada's own bumpy political context.
Yeah.
Our audience will know, of course, that in recent days, Prime Minister Trudeau has announced that he intends to step down as Liberal Party leader and in turn Prime Minister once his party has selected his successor. I'll ask in a moment about the political consequences of this major development. But before we do, I have to ask how you think we ought to understand Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's time in office. How would you go about defining his legacy?
Well, just a few minutes before you and I spoke, I released an article in The Atlantic that I've been working on for a while that tried to do, I can't do full justice to 10 years in 2,500 words, but to try to sort of give an assessment. And I mean, I think the big success of his government was its management of the Trump challenge between 2017 and 18. I give them some credit for their successes during COVID. Canada had a higher vaccination rate than the United States, and a great deal more social cooperation. So that some of that is the Canadian character, but some of that must reflect leadership. It could have been the other way around. And I think some of his experiments with refining the child tax credit, that was a creation of the Stephen Harper years, maybe they were too expensive, but child poverty is bad. Less of it is good. It's worth paying, and if your solutions to it are not the most efficient, still okay. That's an important goal.
Sure.
But the fiscal management was reckless before the pandemic and has been worse since the pandemic. And I think that the thing I blame him most for is his lack of commitment to the idea of Canada as something affirmative, and not just a negative space that isn't America, but an affirmative. And you see this not just in that famous quote of his that he could not define, there's no mainstream in Canada. But his unwillingness to stand up for Canadian history against the slurs of genocide. And he was very ham-fisted. Sometimes he would toggle back and forth. Well, it's cultural genocide, but not real genocide. Maybe it was real. He should have just rebuked all of that. That's his job, to defend his country. And you see that it had very real world here and now consequences for national security in his inability to articulate a clear line against foreign interference. When it was right-wing American money paying for the bus, the truck lockdown in Ottawa, he acted decisively. And by the way, I applaud him for that. Yes. That was not a peaceful protest. That was an attack on government. That was a blockade of the streets funded by foreigners. Crack down, by all means, and stop the flow of foreign money to an attack on the operations of your capital. Yes. But what China did was even more serious with its manipulation of elections, and what India did with its campaign of assassination and terrorism on Canadian soil, more serious still. And because those threats affected people who were his clients and constituents, he was much more namby-pamby. And all along, he was never able to say, this is what it means to be Canadian. This is why we're proud. And you don't have to have like a super precise or exclusive definition, but some sense of nationhood. It's always a problem in Canada. And the job of political leadership is to articulate that and keep it meaningful to people, given that it's a problem. It's not an easy thing to do. The society may not do it so spontaneously on its own.
If I can just stay on this point, because for those who've been with us for past episodes will know it's a line of analysis and argument on which you've been wholly consistent, that to understand Prime Minister Trudeau's legacy is to understand, in your mind, the kind of weakness of his conception of the country and its history itself. That's obviously a bit conceptual, a bit distant from pocketbook issues. Why don't you talk, David, about how, in your mind, that lack of leadership has contributed to the malaise that we're seeing among ordinary Canadians across the country? Yeah. In other words, how do you connect the dots between his lack of leadership, his lack of affirmative vision for Canada, as you put it, and how Canadians from Trois-Rivières to Thunder Bay to Prince George are feeling about themselves and the country?
Well, because he didn't have a strong conception of the country, the way he always did politics was by giving people stuff. And yes, when times are good, as they were in 2017, 2018, 2019, that's more or less easy to do. And you can, even in good times, you can overdo it and get yourself into fiscal trouble. But times have been not so good since 2019 for Canada. And you need to sometimes be able to rally people to say, it's going to be a little painful today. Here are some hard things we have to do to get our national productivity rising again, to make our national market more successful. And if we don't do them, not only do we get poor, but when Canada gets poor, Canada is in danger of falling into the American orbit. One of the reasons that Trump's appeal to 51st state resonates with some Canadians, and I'm afraid that it does, is because Canada right now doesn't look very successful. And you can see this through Canadian history. In moments when the Canadian economy is doing very strongly, like the Wilfrid Laurier years, there's a strong sense of Canadian identity. In moments when the Canadian economy is doing badly, as it did during the Great Depression, there's a weak sense, and Canadians migrate to the United States. Canadian governments lose their control over the provinces, Canadian national governments. So the performance of the Canadian economy and the performance of the Canadian and the strength of the idea of the Canadian nation are always interrelated. Yeah, right. A last thing that needs to be said on this particular score is during the Gaza war, this was maybe not as serious as some of the things I've talked about before, but the inability of the government to ever adhere to a settled line on what it thought, to be pushed and pulled according to who did we upset today? Are friends of Israel mad at us? Are friends of the Palestinians mad at us? And I've described it as a kind of a lawn sprinkler approach, where his head is constantly moving from one side of the lawn and then bumping into something and then heading back to the other side of the lawn and bumping into something there. And I think there are two small moments that I think are sort of characteristic of him. One is a joke that President Obama told about him at the last Obama's last White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2016. And Obama was making a joke about how Obama had aged in office. And he said, one of his jokes in the series was, just yesterday, somebody was saying to me, Obama, look how old and grizzled and gray you are. You're the past. Look at the future is Justin Trudeau. He's so handsome. He's so brilliant. He's so new. He's so fresh. And I said, back off, Justin. And Obama, whose sense of humor could be quite cutting, saw right away that behind all the, sexy enthusiasm there was around Justin Trudeau, at the core was tremendous self-regard. Yes. Now, all politicians have ego, but they don't all have vanity. And that's a different thing. And where that backs into, and this is how his term ends, I think, and this is a view that is not widely shared among politicians, but I really wish it would be more. In a parliamentary system, when your party is in trouble, and that often happens, I think the incumbent prime minister should go down with the ship. I think Justin Trudeau should not have resigned. And I think, by the way, that Brian Mulroney should not have resigned. You fight that last election knowing you will lose as your last service to your party. You take all the odium on yourself and let the party start with a new leader who's got a fresh opportunity, and count on history to do you justice. I mean, Brian Mulroney had lost personally the election in 1993. Today, who would remember?
Yes.
We would remember free trade. We'd remember GST. We'd remember the clean air and clean water things he did. We would remember him as one of the most effective Canadian prime ministers of them all. And his record would be solid. And that the last defeat, well, McDonald lost elections too. But he would have given whoever succeeded him, maybe Kim Campbell, the opportunity to fight an election on much more favorable terms. And Justin Trudeau is doing the same thing. I don't have an opinion about what kind of prime minister Mark Carney will be, except that we'll never find out, because what they're going to do is hand off the prime ministership from the leadership from Trudeau to Carney just in time for Carney to suffer an historic wipeout, for which Carney will be blamed. And then I don't know that either the party or Carney will have the patience to stick around to do it again one or two more times that it will take to revive a parliamentary party. So go down with the ship, and it is an act of ego not to go down with the ship. Mulroney's record was so impressive in so many other ways, and his standing was so bad in 1993 that maybe there was no choice. But Justin Trudeau could have stuck around for 3 more months, or called the election right away. He could have called the election now, had lost it, and turned over a party to a new leader.
Yeah, man, what a ton of insight in that answer. I could respond to your comments about the relationship between Canada's economic standing and the people's sense of self-assuredness and confidence, not just about themselves, but the country, and the need for policymakers to keep that in mind, which is to say, the response to the malaise we find ourselves is not just more Sir John A. Macdonald statues, as important and as nice as they may be, but it's actually about getting the economy going, as not just an economic measure, but a one about our civic life as well. And then your point about Trudeau's ego, I think you're precisely right, David. I might feel differently if he made this decision 18 months ago or 24 months ago and given his successor a reasonable shot at defining him or herself and carrying out a government. But that he waited until the last possible moment when there was essentially no good option for him, the party, his successor, or frankly, the country, I think risks doing real harm to his legacy, including the parts of his legacy that people might feel good about. You've been so generous with your time. I just have a couple of questions left, and in a way, you wrapped up your final answer anticipating my next one, which is to say that the race to succeed him is shaping up to be between Chrystia Freeland, the former finance minister, and Mark Carney, Canada's a former central bank governor, who happens to also be the godfather to Freeland's son. Yeah. So it's a small world, David. Yeah. How do you score the leadership race, and what might it tell us about the state of Liberal Party politics in Canada, and political trends more broadly across the advanced world?
I think for parties of the center left across the advanced world, there's really one question. The Liberals, I think, will debate this question too, but it's unclear who will be on which side of it. The question was Tony Blair, was Bill Clinton right? That is the job of the center left to run a dynamic, strong, free enterprise economy, tax it, and then use the taxation to pay for social insurance? Or, like Joe Biden, and like Justin Trudeau in his last months, were Clinton and Blair wrong? And the right approach is the Biden approach, where the government interferes directly in the making of wealth. Advocates of this view call it pre-distribution, redistribution instead of redistribution. Yes. And they talk about overthrowing the neoliberal paradigm. Yes. And the government will direct funds, and Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor to Biden, gave a full-throated defense of this in a speech in the Biden administration called it Foreign Policy for the Middle Class. Yes. And center-left people get very excited about it. The only thing wrong is its record of proven failure. And not just in one country, but in every place where it's tried. And not just in one historical period, but in every period where it's tried. Meanwhile, the Blair-Clinton record, I mean, it's like, did you ever see that old show, The Munsters, where the pretty girl is the one who's thought of as homely and all the monsters think they're beautiful? Yes. Like there's the Clinton and Blair record of success waiting to be scooped up, like the pretty monster. And then there's this record of everybody else, like saying, what if we direct $50 billion toward building a battery industry in Canada? How will that work out? Badly. Oh, okay. How did it work out the last time? Badly. How did it work out when the Portuguese tried it? Badly. It always works out badly. The Clinton and Blair record worked out well. And so the question for the liberals, the question for the Democrats is who will be there to speak for what worked and against what failed.
Yeah. And just as I pivot to my last question, may I say the same question will ultimately need to be addressed by Republicans and conservatives. It's not lost on me that as we're speaking, Marco Rubio is set to appear in a Senate confirmation hearing, and by all accounts, will essentially make the case against many of the strengths of so-called neoliberalism that you're talking about.
There's really one question for him, which is you put in front of a plate with a toad on it. Say, Senator Rubio, Secretary Designate, how badly do you want this job? Let's see you eat that toad.
Final question, as I promised. As you outlined earlier, the Conservative Party of Canada remains strong in the polls. There's even evidence that they've experienced a bit of a bump in the immediate aftermath of Prime Minister Trudeau's resignation. How do the two developments that we've been talking about today, Trump's provocations on one hand and a new political opponent on the other hand, change things for the Conservatives? What's your advice for them on both these fronts?
Well, the Trump problem is very acute because there is a substantial minority within the Conservative Party world, and maybe even within the caucus, that has a hankering admiration and affection for Trump and wants the Conservative Party of Canada to be more like it. I think on the merits, you know, my view is it doesn't matter. The thing they need to keep in mind, the voters they need,
yes,
don't agree. Yes. And if you are tempted in Canada to do a base first strategy, think again. That it's not a two-party system. It is not a system with deep cultural and ideological loyalties. That most voters have at least a couple of parties that they would consider. I think there's a lot of the kind of people who vote Green have backgrounds similar to the people who voted Conservative or used to vote Conservative. And certainly in Europe, we've seen a migration from traditional parties of the right to Greens, because the Greens are always a very, very middle-class party, and more often more than middle-class party. So don't do base first. Don't indulge the Trumpy factions within your party, and keep speaking clearly about Trump as a threat for Canada, not an opportunity. And make the case for a conservative. Because the conservative is so patriotic in the defense of Canadian tradition way, and will stand up for John A. Macdonald. They will stand up for Canadian independence, and are not the local branch plant of Trumpism. That's really important. I don't think there's much liberals can do. I mean, it's like saying there's an avalanche coming, and you can do a good job putting up the little wooden barriers, or you can do a bad job putting up the little wooden barriers. But the little wooden barriers aren't going to do you a lot of good, and especially because the late deciders are the least informed voters, and the least informed voters are those who don't know about all these sort of subtle reinventions, the minute distinctions that will exist between whoever is the next leader of the Liberal Party and whoever is the last. The Liberal Party is a brand. It stands for a lot of propositions in Canadian voters' minds. It was responsible for 10 years of okay economic performance, but that got weak even before the pandemic, overspending during the pandemic, and then much disappointment after. So again, Justin Trudeau should have gone down with the ship. That should have been his final service to the party, and then take the defeat, clean break, rebuild, and have a plan to win the election after next.
David, what a jam-packed episode for our first of 2025. I'm glad to be back with you, and I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Bye-bye.